Hey, it's Sloan on 700 WLW. We have over 15 intelligence-related agencies here in the United States. And something 3 years later, there's no consensus on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and the outbreak. So if we don't know, how do we prevent a future unknown outbreak from occurring? With the answers, Brad Wenstrup. He's, of course, our congressman and also chairman and the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, the man with all the juice on this. What is the task of the subcommittee?
Well, basically, it's an after-action review of everything of the last few years concerning the coronavirus pandemic, and we want to have the lessons learned and hopefully come forward with a path forward for not only the United States, but for maybe around the world, maybe to help the WHO, but to have best practices of a team approach to how we manage a pandemic. We have to look at the things we did right and the things that we did wrong. And that includes members of Congress or Congress as a body. When you look at the things that we passed to try and keep the economy going, did it work? Where's the money now? All those types of things are part of this. And of course, the origins of COVID is part of that as well.
And it's important because, as I said in the intro, how do you prevent a future unknown outbreak if you don't know how this one started and you learn from that? The problem is dealing with the Chinese and trying to get information out of them. Good luck. But I guess if this were the result of a lab leak, though, you have to find out how it started to prevent it from ever happening again. That's the whole point of this thing. And that's probably also why we don't have any consensus among all the intelligence agencies in this country of how it began.
Well, amongst the intelligence agencies, what I'm trying to look at, too, during this investigation is finding out who they actually spoke to in each of the intelligence communities to come up with their conclusions. Because if one of the communities had 20 virologists, which is probably the most effective tool, is to hear from actual virologists, and another community just had one or no virologists, their opinions are going to differ. So I have asked to know what are the degrees and what are the specialties of the people in each of the communities, because why are they all so different? Yeah. Shouldn't they all have the same information? Shouldn't they be talking to a similar set of people? And I will tell you that the FBI and the Department of Energy, they have the most relevant scientists for this type of investigation.
People go, energy department. Oh yeah, their science and labs are it's incredible. So, but that's good that we're getting all branches of government and all bureaucracies and bureaucratic elements together to try and figure this thing out. The only question is the biggest piece of the puzzle that's missing, right, is the data in signs that these biosafety issues reported in China to try and get that information, because there's literally missing pieces of the puzzle, right?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of them that you're going to start hearing about after the Senate report. And I'm sitting on Intelligence Committee in the House. We have been working with the Senate, and when they were putting their report together, and they did some very serious investigations, very thorough investigations, and down to, really what a Chinese lab is even looking like and the safety measures that might be at the lab. And, as we have seen reported time and time again, people fell ill. Researchers from the Wuhan lab fell ill in the fall of 2019. And what we heard from John Ratcliffe in our coronavirus pandemic subcommittee hearing the other day and he's the former director of national intelligence, the person who has exposure to more intelligence than anybody. He said a lab leak is the only credible explanation supported by intelligence. Robert Redfield, who was the CDC director and virologist, had said that the final answers are not going to come from science. They're going to come from intelligence. And in part, that goes to what you said, because China has not been cooperative. And Director Ratcliffe said that if China had cooperated with the international organizations and shared information sooner, the pandemic could have been prevented. That is his opinion. And he stated his things with high confidence.
Well, since you killed millions and millions of non-Chinese citizens, the coronavirus did, COVID-19 in particular, is there, and this is out of your scope maybe too, but is there some sort of punishment? Is there a backlash towards the Chinese government? I haven't seen it for sure. Where's the UN and these organizations that are supposed to look out for the free world?
Well, that's who would have to do that. And if we can't trust our international organizations And we can't trust some of the members of those international organizations. And especially when it comes to health, that's a problem. The World Health Organization should be there for the benefit of all humankind, regardless of politics. But if you look at the joint WHO and China report, they excluded people they didn't want. They didn't give people access to things, and then came away and said, oh, it didn't come from the lab. But they have no evidence that it came from nature or anywhere else, and they very much restricted who could be in there. And the WHO has backed away from that, and they are trying, at least it seems like they are trying to realign this into a legitimate organization that can be free of politics.
Brad Wenstrup, do you think someone inside China knows, or did they destroy all the evidence and get rid of all the people that would?
Well, there are some mysterious missing persons, if you will, in China right now. And there was even one who probably had some very good information who happened to fall out of a window. So none of this stuff looks very good. And so there's preponderance of evidence that there's a cover-up. And that's the type of thing that we're looking into and getting more and more information. The Senate report that just came out, I think, is going to be very telling. And it has a lot to do and very similar to what we did on Intelligence Committee in the House. But again, we did work with them through the process.
Yeah. As I understand it, too, in the Senate report, that there's no evidence that documents we don't know which animal spread the virus to humans. How important is that to find that out?
Well, I think it would have been found by now. And that's the thing. Previously, when we had, for example, SARS and MERS, you found the animal. You found the one that would, transition this from animal to human. And we haven't found that. And China would love to find that, but they haven't been able to. And so that tells us, and that's not without extensive testing, but there have been articles written in part by people that were funding research in Wuhan. So Americans who were funding research at Wuhan, taxpayer dollars through the NIH, they have written articles saying, oh, it came from the lab. Well, I can understand they've written it, they came from nature. And I can understand why they don't want it to come from the lab because they were involved with research there. And even if it wasn't directly gain-of-function research, which I suspect some of it was, money's fungible. And if you're there doing coronavirus research, then you're part of the equation. And that all has to be answered as well.
No doubt about it. Congressman Brad Wenstrup on the show. He's the chairman of the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic and tasked with finding out where it came from specifically and which animal, if it's lab, if it's a wet market. We don't know because, the Chinese is covering this whole thing up, and that is hard to try and figure out, although that's where the intelligence agencies come in. So as he said, if you're just joining, it's going to be solved by the intelligence agencies and not by scientists, which is certainly telling for what's happening inside China and has been for a long, long time. We also know, too, that I guess I read somewhere that they think maybe it could be a lab animal escaped, right? I mean, that's a possibility here, too, right? That it was in the lab, but the animal got out, and now we have COVID-19. That would kind of make both sides right?
Yeah, that one I would find hard to believe. I mean, I know they work with what they call humanized mice, right?
Mm-hmm.
They make them take on more of a human form, so when they test something, they can see how a human would react as well. I find it hard to believe one of the mice would get out, but if researchers were falling ill in Wuhan and they go to this wet market in Wuhan,
right,
where there are animals, granted, that's what they sell there.
Yep.
Then it's feasible that this was the first super spreader, but they haven't found an animal that contains this virus. And the theory is, well, it seems like there was a cluster of an outbreak near the raccoon dogs that they sell. Well, why haven't you found the herd of raccoon dogs where these came from and test them? I think that looks more like a less plausible explanation. Let's put it that way, and I'm being kind.
Yeah. And the other thing too is it was only, I think, a couple months ago, and talking this with someone else, Brad Wenstrup, I learned that there's such a thing as a raccoon dog, to show you how messed up this is.
Yeah, and in some ways, if you think if it's the same people that were doing the research in the lab on coronaviruses saying that it came from the raccoon dog, It almost sounds like the raccoon dog ate my homework. Let's put it that way.
Right. Well, I say that for a long time. Listen, we enjoy freshly butchered meat here and aged fine beef, right? But yeah, maybe when it's monkeys and bats and raccoon dogs, maybe you, I don't know, want to can that stuff, process it a little bit. Yeah, processed meat will kill you, but look at what a raccoon dog did to the whole world.
Well, it's look, in the Chinese system and their civilization, they live amongst the animals more than we do. And so for something to come from nature is not unheard of. We've seen that with the previous viruses. But in this particular case, they haven't found any proof of that. And as Director Ratcliffe said during the hearing, he said, if you look at the ledger of evidence that it came from nature and the ledger of evidence that it may have come from the lab,
yeah,
there's virtually nothing on the nature side, and all of these things pointing towards the lab. How can we not follow the breadcrumbs on that? And
right.
At the same time, Scott, follow the money.
Yeah. Representative Wenstrup, too, the other thing is there's a spike protein that they're looking at, and we're not sure that and it hinges on the structure, right, of the virus itself. Is there's this mutation, and they're looking at, there's a debate in the scientific community that it could be man-made, but we're not sure.
Well, that is really the debate, but we know from an article in 2015 with Ralph Barrick in North Carolina and Dr. Zhengli Shi in Wuhan at the lab, they created a chimera or a gain-of-function virus where you take a portion of one virus and add it to another, one that isn't infectious, and now it's infectious. And in this case, infectious to humans is the great concern there. Something called a fusion cleavage site. And the way I compare it simply is, R2-D2 likes to plug into systems and get all the information, right, and get into the system. But if his little attachment doesn't work, you take a different one that does work, attach it to R2-D2, and you get in. So think of it that way about what it takes to get into the human cell. And if you put the key to the human cell on another virus, that's what opens the gate.
Makes sense. And it also, too, the information is showing and indicating that we've seen in the Senate report is that this lab in Wuhan was definitely vulnerable to something happening, something getting out of that lab because of their procedures.
Their procedures were sloppy. We knew this before the pandemic. They had a history of leaks from the lab, maybe not as serious as this. And they were doing some research at an inappropriate lab for what they were doing. That's what all the evidence is starting to show.
Got it.
And we're gonna try and confirm all those things.
What you have so far, evidence-wise, now obviously you don't want to tip your hand here because it's intelligence, Representative Wenstrup. But if there's a smoking gun here, is it become clear where that smoking gun may originate? Where the smoking gun is? Finding the smoking gun is one thing, but getting the pieces together to point you towards where it is where you are right now in that game. How close are you getting?
Well, the smoking gun may never really be found because some of the people that could speak up and be the smoking gun don't seem to be around anymore. And I would tell you, too, I got a threatening letter, if you will, from the Chinese embassy just the other day before our most recent hearing, telling us how much they oppose this and we shouldn't do it and you should speak with scientists. Well, it is interesting that in bipartisan fashion, we have 7 positions on our committee, but we are speaking to scientists. Our research and our witnesses are scientists. So in rebuttal, I may ask them to send us their scientists who we have not been able to hear from. Right. And I'll point them out by name because I know their research and I know some of the public comments they have made. So we would like to have them come in and speak to our committee, but I don't think I'll get very far with that.
I don't think so. Say, well, let's when you have your scientists come over, we'll even fly you over here, and when you sit in front of this select subcommittee, and we'll find out what the story is. But they're probably not going to be the ones associated with what happened, and also just touting the government line. It'll be a waste of time for everyone. But and I'm sure you're really threatened by the Chinese letter too. I could hear the fear in your voice.
It seems to be standard operational procedure for them. And I would tell you one other thing too that there has been a public comment. The former CDC director for China has come out publicly and said there is no evidence that this came from nature.
Interesting. I'm going to leave
take
it.
That.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a good step. I know you got to go, but how confident are you that you'll find the answer?
I think that we'll have a preponderance of evidence that would say we can evaluate this and with high confidence feel that this came from the lab. More importantly, though, at the end of the day, through all this, we want to be able to have a plan for the next pandemic, either from nature or from a lab. And I will tell you, sitting on the Intelligence Committee, being a soldier, I have concerns about the ability to create a very infectious virus when it comes to bioweapons from an adversary.
Has China changed their game as far as security at labs go because of this?
Well, that's going to be part of the recommendations that we make, is that an organization like the WHO is able to have access and oversight over labs all around the world to make sure that if there's research taking place, that it is done efficiently and in the best of circumstances. Look, in 2012, Dr. Fauci was asked in an article that I read a couple years ago, he was asked about gain-of-function research. His general feeling was create an infectious virus and be able to cure it, and then we can cure anything.
Yeah.
Okay, that's his scientific thought. They asked him, they said, are you concerned about it getting out and creating a pandemic? And this is in 2012. He said, well, I think the benefits outweigh the risk because I think it's very unlikely it'll get out. Well, that was a concern then, should be a concern now.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's like Saddam Hussein, right? We'll let the weapons inspectors. Well, we're not going to really let you. Well, no, never mind. And it's the same thing when you're dealing with a desperate regime. Representative Brad Wenstrup, thanks. All the best to you, Doctor. Thanks again for the time.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. That's Brad Wenstrup, Congressman here on the Scott Sloan Show on 700 WLW, Chairman of the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. All right, let me get to news, and then Dr. Lakshmi Samarko, Hamilton County Coroner, the next street drug battle we're facing in Cincinnati. Yeah, we got a new one, and it should scare the crap out of you as the past ones have. That's the idea. Next, Sloaney, 700 WLW.